There we go. All right. Well, tonight we're going to talk about propagating from seeds. Kind of split this talk into two parts. But first we'll have some commercials. Just a minute here. I'm going to get rid of part of this screen. Move this out of the way. All right. So next Tuesday, I'm starting a course at the University of Guelph through the Arboretum. They have a series of workshops, and mine's called Garden Fundamentals. It's a 6-week course, I think, every Tuesday night. And you can sign up just for the nights you're interested in. You don't have to sign up for the whole thing. There is a small fee involved. And we're going to go through, one night will be on soils, one on perennials, one on trees and shrubs, bulbs and grasses, I think weeds and myths maybe. I can't remember. There's no vegetable talks in this course. We took that out and made it a separate course. So anything that has nothing to do with vegetables. So you can get in touch with me through these various means. I have a YouTube channel called Garden Fundamentals. And in fact, I have quite a few YouTube videos there on starting things from seed. I also have a Facebook group called Garden Fundamentals, and I have a blog called Garden Fundamentals. So if you search for that, you'll be able to find me. So we're going to split this into two parts. The first part is on seed germination, and we'll talk about a few topics in there. We're not going to cover everything in seed germination, but I kind of picked some highlighted areas. And then we're going to talk about how do you get seedlings to mature plants. That seems to be a problem of some people. Well, where do seeds come from? They come from your garden. And a very common advice that you get is leave the seed pods on the plant until the seed's ripe. And in some cases, the seed pod will open. Other cases, the seed pod goes brown. But you want to make sure that that seed is a good dark color. So we're looking for blacks and dark browns. And that's the common advice. But in fact, that's not necessarily the best advice. That works for a lot of plants, but it doesn't work well for some of our natives. So here's a pod off a hosta plant, obviously not a native. It's green. It doesn't look like it's ready. But actually, when we open it up, the seeds are already fully developed. So you don't have to wait till the pod gets brown before you harvest these seeds. So the seeds that have the little balls in them are ready to be planted up. There's a couple good ones there. This one looks like the embryo hasn't developed properly. It's too flat. These little things here, they're just junk. They didn't develop, so you throw those away. But here's another one that's a little more interesting. And this is our native white Trillium, grandiflorum. And if you wait until the seed pod is fully mature, nice and brown, the seeds are nice and dark, you've actually waited too long. First of all, there's a good chance that some rodent has come and eaten your seeds, and you won't get them to harvest. But the real reason is that if you wait that long, you'll actually have a much harder time germinating these seeds. Seed pods produce seeds, and sometimes they're ripe long before the pod looks right. Long before the pod looks ripe. So we want to start thinking about these and harvest them really early. Here's a picture of this pod when it's opened up. And this is actually a bit on the late side already. These seeds, they're light brown. So some people would say, well, they're not ready to harvest. They're not dark enough. We should have left a pod. But in fact, you can harvest trilliums when these seeds are still just past the green stage. And they actually germinate better like that. So here's some germinated Trillium seeds. Botany CA, by the way, is a friend of mine. She operates a little seed house out of Waterloo, and she sells a lot of native seed that she collects, and she also sells seed from overseas, particularly with the Romania area. She travels there quite a bit, and she even gets seed out of my garden. So let's look at germinating some Trillium seed. And I've just arbitrarily picked some dates here so it kind of makes sense to you. The first column, these are Trillium seeds that we are going to treat in the traditional way. We're going to let them dry. So in late summer 2020, we collect the seed, we dry it up, we let it sit around dry, and then in the spring we come along and we try to germinate that seed. And there's a very good chance that that seed will never germinate because it's dead. In fact, this is one of the problems with buying Trillium seed, is that if it's packaged dry and shipped dry, by the time you get it in spring, there's a very good chance it's dead. And of course, you're not going to get any germination. But since germinating Trilliums is a very slow process, you might work at this for a couple of years and then finally give up because you had dead seeds to start with. Now we can do this a little different. If we look at the middle column, we can harvest this seed, but keep it moist. When it's in that seed pod with the picture you've seen there, that seed is still quite wet. And we want to keep it that way. It goes from there into a little baggie with some peat moss or some vermiculite. It's kind of funny that I prefer peat moss, and Botany CA, she prefers vermiculite. And we both have our reasons why our choice is best. But if you do them properly, they both work. The key is you've got to keep them moist. Now, if we planted them, in fact, we don't even have to plant them. We can just leave them in that vermiculite and they're moist. They will start germinating in the fall of 2020. So September, October, you'll have some seeds germinate. Not a lot of them. Most of them won't germinate, but some will germinate that early. So now we keep them cool. And the ones that germinated will make their first leaf in the spring of 2021. Okay? So this is a fast way to speed up the germination. Now remember, the other seeds haven't germinated. They act more like the last column here. We're going to collect the same kinds of seed. We're going to keep them cool. We're going to keep them moist. They just don't germinate until the spring. And then in the spring of 2021, they will make a root and they do form a little tuber. We keep them cool and then they make a leaf the following spring. And the last column is the traditional way to grow these trilliums. And this applies to other of our native plants. They need this double season, 2 cold periods before you actually see a leaf. And this leads some people to an incorrect conclusion that these plants have what they call a double dormancy. And they equate double dormancy with needing 2 cold periods. Well, that's wrong on a couple levels. If we go back a slide, you'll see that the first brown column there, they actually germinate a few months after collecting the seed. They don't have double dormancy. They don't need 2 cold periods to germinate, at least some of the seed. The second reason double dormancy isn't true is that it kind of depends on the definition of what germination is. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. All right, so we have a bunch of seeds. How do you go about germinating these? Well, the good news is that most seed are easy germinators. So they germinate quickly. So within a week, they're germinated. They don't have a dormancy period. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. There's no pre-treatment required, and they're pretty easy to grow. Actually, the no pre-treatment is not quite correct either, because all seed has to absorb water. And we could consider that as a pre-treatment, but it generally happens automatic when you put them in the soil and you water that soil. Or if you use one of the other techniques like the Baggy technique, they automatically get that water. And that's the only pre-treatment they need. So most seed does not need anything special. What are the easy germinators? Well, most vegetables, most annuals, and a lot of the common perennials are very easy to germinate. In fact, I just did some cone flowers and they germinate within 3 days and they're up and running. The difficult germinators generally fit into this category. So most of our native perennials are more difficult. Most trees and shrubs, a lot of the rock garden plants, and the more unusual perennials. So if they're in this category, they may need something special. Now I'm going to show you an easy way to figure out what you have to do to germinate these. But before I do, let's talk about the actual germination process. It all starts with pollination. The seed develops on the mother plant, and then at some point it reaches maturity. I think gardeners don't really understand that maturity stage, though. We all think that when it's good and black or really dark brown, that's a mature state, and that's not necessarily true. An interesting example is the tomato. I mean, most of us, I think, and I'm included in this, in fact, a year ago, I would have said this was true. A tomato is not going to have mature seed until it's fully ripe, which is a red tomato. Well, it turns out the seed is actually fully developed and will germinate quite well when the tomato is still green. It's a special stage which is called the breaker stage, and that tomato is just getting a bit of pink on it. That seed is fully mature as far as the plant's concerned. And we're going to test that this summer because I found that out a little late. But it also means that that pink stage is a good time to pick your fruit, and it will actually ripen completely inside that way. Anyways, that's a different topic. So now that seed is mature and it's gone into a state of dormancy. And if we treat that seed correctly, that seed will last a long time. But we have two groups of seeds. We have about 85–90% of the seed we can dry and it will last a long time, and then we can moisten it and it germinates. But there's that 15% of seed that if we let dry, it dies very quickly. In both cases, though, that seed is in a state of dormancy and it needs something to come out of dormancy. When you see the root come out, that's germination. Then, of course, the root comes out, the leaves come out, and the plant grows and eventually becomes mature. Where there's confusion is in this germination stage, because a lot of people put these seeds in the soil and they cover them with soil, so they can't see what's actually going on. And most people think of germination as being the same thing as seeing some green shoots above soil level. And those two things are not the same thing. Germination happens when the root comes out. And if you use this definition for germination, then I don't think there's any seed that has a double dormancy. All right, so we have seed dormancy. And what is it? Well, here's what the chemists say. We're not going to go into this slide. The reason I put this in is that this actually shows the process of a seed coming out of dormancy, and it illustrates all of the various enzymes and chemicals involved in making that seed germinate. It's a very, very complicated process on a chemical level. And so sometimes it's funny when people think that, well, there's this rule of germinating seeds and it applies to all seeds. Well, it doesn't. They all have different genetics. They all have different pathways here. And it's a very complicated process. So seed dormancy is something that genetically is built into the seed to prevent it from germinating too soon. I mean, this makes a lot of sense when we think about a plant. It's sitting here in August making seed. The seed's nice and ripe. If that hit the ground and germinated right away, most seed would get killed with the winter. So there's a system built in to make it extend longer periods. Most of it will germinate the next spring after a cool period. But many plants actually program the seed so they don't all germinate at the same time. And this happens in trilliums. So in every seed head, there is some seed that will germinate quickly. There's some that will germinate the following year, and there's some that will germinate in 3 or 4 years. And the plant is actually programmed to delay some of the seed to germinate later. And all of those seeds are in the same seed pod. These aren't different plants or different seed pods. They're the same seeds in the same pod, but for some reason, they're chemically different, and some will germinate sooner than others. So what do these seeds need? The first thing they need is water. Until they absorb some water, nothing really happens. And then there's all kinds of problems. Some seeds have very hard seed coats, and we have to do something about that. A lot of the berries are in, a lot of the seed that's in berries, that fleshy stuff around the berry actually contains inhibitors. Those chemicals prevent that seed from germinating. Some seed is completely undeveloped, so it just takes time. So your seed is mature, sort of, we call it mature, but it actually just has to sit there for many months doing absolutely nothing. No water, no temperature changes, no nothing. It just has to sit there and slowly develop. We have to think of seed as being a living organism, and it is. It's breathing, it's producing CO2, it's taking in oxygen, it's having chemical reactions take place. It's just very slow. Some seed needs light, some seed needs dark. Actually, very few seeds need dark, but quite a few need the light. A lot of them need changes in temperature to grow properly. So how do you know what a seed needs to germinate? Well, I don't know, but the place I go to get my answers is this, the website called Ontario Rock Garden Society and Hardy, it's actually the Ontario Rock Garden and Hardy Plant Society. They've changed the name. And over the last 20 years, they've developed a database of plants and the germination mechanism required for those plants. And it's the most extensive list that I know of on the internet. So I always go here first, and they'll give you a letter code. They'll tell you how to germinate it, and I follow that advice. And this database gets updated as people germinate seeds and report different ways of germinating that seed. So the information is kept fresh. So this is my #1 place that I go to. The downside for some gardeners is that you have to know the botanical name to find anything, but I think that's a good thing anyways. So you look up the plant and it will tell you exactly what to do. And those are the pre-treatments. Now let's look at some things that you might do. Scarification is nicking the seed coat or scratching the seed coat. It can be done a number of different ways. You can use files, you can use nail clippers. And in fact, I have a whole video on scarification and show you different ways of doing it. This is generally done to seed that has a very hard seed coat. Soaking is very common. Now, sometimes if you put these seeds in the wet soil, they'll soak up enough water, but certain seeds actually do better with a pre-soaking. So a lot of species irises do very well with a soaking for about a week's period. And what you do is you put them in some water, you pour the water off every day, put in some fresh water, pour it off again, put some fresh water in, and so on. And you do that for a full week so that they get a lot of water inside the seed. And then they germinate easily, and sometimes they still will take 2 years to germinate. When I first started growing iris species, they were really easy. I could germinate anything. And then I started doing some of the more fancy irises, the ones that are harder to find, and they're actually quite tough to germinate. Scarification is a very common treatment. So plants that naturally grow in cold climates have a winter, and so many of them are programmed to go through a cold, warm cycle. And some plants do better if they get a warm cycle first. So they might spend 3 months warm because that seed's not fully developed yet. The embryo is not really developed. So it needs that warm period to continue developing. And then it needs a cold cycle. Others, you give a cold cycle and then a warm cycle. And there's certainly seed around where you have to go warm, cold until these things germinate. Some people use GA3 hormone, and you have to watch this hormone. It can kill seeds quite easily. So if you use too much or you soak too long, it will actually damage plants. And most seed does not need it. You have to be a little careful with it. So here's an example of using GA3. So unfortunately, it's not a local native one, but it's a Podophyllum hexandrum, which now has been called the Cynopodophyllum. It takes 2 to 3 years before you'll see the first leaf come up. It's a very slow germinator. And it's one of these seeds that will take a couple of cycles to just put out a root, and then it needs another cold cycle to put up a leaf, and it's a slow process. Now, if you take that same seed and treat it with GA3, you can have a leaf in 8 weeks. It's quite amazing. And in fact, just warm. You don't have to give it any cold cycles whatsoever. So we basically saved 2 to 3 years in the process. Okay. So it can work in a lot of seeds. Unfortunately, most seed has not been tested yet, so we don't actually know if it works. That's a picture of the plant. It's actually a very nice plant. There are other things that people try. Hydrogen peroxide is a common recommendation. I haven't found a lot of cases where it actually works, but there are some reports where hydrogen peroxide will speed up germination. Professional labs do use acids. I don't really recommend them for homeowners because they're strong acids that they're using. Some areas, there's some seed and trees on the West Coast that need to have a fire to germinate that seed. Smoke is an unusual one, but apparently a lot of the seed in Australia needs to be exposed to smoke. And so people will actually get the seed and make little smudge piles and smoke the seed. And that apparently helps germination. That's one I've never really tried. Here's another example. These are berries from our Jack-in-the-pulpit, our native plant. And I generally collect them at this stage. The seeds are pretty much ripe. You can pull them off, you clean the seeds, get rid of the fruit. It is toxic, so be a little careful. Some people wash their hands or wear gloves. I usually don't bother. It's never bothered me, but it does have oxalic acid in it. There are some rodents that will eat these, and I guess they're not bothered, or maybe they are bothered and they're no longer with me. But if I leave these in the woods, they usually get eaten. So one thing I do with these is I put organza bags over top. They're little cloth bags to protect the fruit until it develops properly, and then I go out and harvest them that way. So the way I normally germinate these, and I've done this with about 20 different species of Ericema, I get the seed, say Christmas time, first couple of weeks in January. I put them in my Baggy method. They sit in there for 3 to 4 weeks. They're warm germinators. I get like 98% germination all the time with every one I've tried, and away you go. And you grow them, they grow fairly quickly. Last fall, something unusual happened. So I had a really big seed head, and I put an organza bag on it, and it's out in the woods, and I just forgot about it. And I found it, let's call it sort of the 1st of November. You know, all the leaves are already on the ground, and I just happened to see it sticking up. And I thought, oh, I better collect these seeds. I brought them in, washed them all, put them into my Baggy system, and they germinated within a week, which I was really surprised at. And I'm wondering if it was the cold fall that did that, or I was just lucky. I mean, it's only one seed head, so you really can't reach any conclusions. But it's possible that that was enough of a cold treatment to speed up the germination. In any case, they germinated really quickly. So I potted them up, and I had a big pot of these guys. This is what the seed looks like, and all Erythema seed looks pretty much identical, although I'm sure under a microscope you can tell the difference. So here's my pot of seedlings, and these were growing under lights in December and January and February. And then I'm thinking, well, now what the heck do I do with these things? Well, Erythema grow kind of strange. They make one leaf, and that's it for the first year. And it doesn't matter how well you take care of these guys. You can water them, fertilize them, do anything you want. It's going to make one leaf, and then it goes dormant. So with Erythema, the trick is to get them to grow as long as you can, and that makes the biggest bulb inside. Anyways, I thought, well, I'm going to try something a little different with these guys. So about 2 weeks ago, I forced them into dormancy by cutting all the leaves off, and most of them were already brown anyways. It was only the later germinating ones that were still green. And here's a picture of the little bulb it made, very tiny little things. But that's it. That's a first year growth. So normally that pot or the bulbs would be in the ground somewhere, and they would die back, and they'd be underground all summer and then all winter, and then the following year they'd make another leaf. Well, I'm going to try to cheat this year. So I got all the bulbs out, and they're sitting in the fridge. I'm going to give them a 3-month cold period, and then I'm going to bring them back out. That will be mid-spring here, and I'm hoping to get another set of leaves. So I'm hoping to squeeze 2 growth periods into 1 year. So I'll get seeds faster. All right, so that's enough seed stuff. Let's talk about how do we get the seeds to mature plants. And I'm pretty much going to show you what I do. I end up with a pot like this. I generally sow all the seeds in the one pot, partly because I'm usually doing 100 to 300 different seeds, and I have lots of pots, and I just can't take these out and pot them up individually. Ideally, if you had the space and you had enough lights inside, as soon as these things germinate, it would be nice to put each one into its individual pot, and it will grow much faster that way. But I just can't have the space for that. So they get stuck in this community pot until they can go outside. So these plants are now outside. It's late spring, and I have these pots of seedlings. The one on the left there is penstemon. I'm not sure what the one on the right is aconitum. It's a vining one, and then a little rock garden plant, and so on. So I have these pots, and they're now quite crowded. They're all different sizes. So I go through and I decide how many of these seedlings do I really want. And in most cases, I'm only growing a couple for my garden. I want to see them. I don't even know if these are going to be good ones. I don't always know if they're hardy here, if they like my soil and so on. So I don't have a nursery. I'm not growing them for a lot of different people. So I will usually take out 4 of the strongest plants and pot them up. Here's a close-up of some of the plants. Yeah, so the aconitum is alboviolaceum, which is a really interesting climber. It makes small pinkish purplish kind of flowers. The other group of plants that I grow a lot of are bulbs, and they're kind of interesting. So you get this seed, and some bulbs are pretty easy to grow. Other bulbs are really difficult to grow, but they all look the same as seedlings. They all look like grass. So the first year you get germination, you got a grass blade that comes up, not a lot grows. The next year you get a bigger grass blade that comes up. And I actually take all my bulbs and keep them in a separate part of the garden because a lot of these will go dormant in the summer and I don't want to throw them out thinking that there's nothing in there. So I actually keep the bulbs in one place and I mark them with a special stick that tells me that there was something there in the spring and now it's gone dormant. So this is a bulb that's probably at the end of the second summer of growth. And at that point, I dump the pot out and I look for the bulbs and then I pot them up, give them a little more space. Bulbs don't mind being really crowded in a community pot for a couple of years. It doesn't seem to slow them down. The other perennials, I'll either pot up singly, and so now we're looking at larger pots. These are sort of 6-inch pots. The one on the right is a gas plant, and it's a single plant that is actually a first-year seedling, and it grew really fast. The pot on the left is something else, and I usually put 3 or 4 plants in there. I figure if I put 4 in, 1 will die over the winter, 3 will survive, and out of those I have 1 plant for my garden and 2 for friends, and that's all I really need. And I really can't afford to put them into individual pots because I would just have too many pots and too much space. If I had less plants, then I would pot them up individually. So now these have all been potted up. They have a little more space. They're growing very nicely. We got to do something over the winter. And I leave everything in pots because at this stage, they're still quite small plants. And I know if I put them into the garden like this, I will lose them. Either they get weeded out or something grows over top and shades them too much. So I like to keep all of these in pots until they're big enough for the garden. And that varies depending on the plant. Sometimes this happens in a year or two. Sometimes it takes several years, particularly the shrubs. I like them 2 or 3 feet tall, so it takes a little longer. By the way, the one seed that I waited the longest for was a Helicia Carolina, and a friend of mine gave me some seeds. I had about 8 seeds, and they started to germinate after 5 years. And I kept moving them in and out of the fridge, warm, cold, warm, cold. And eventually about half of them germinated, and now I have like 4 plants. The other 4 seeds are still in the fridge, but I think this year they're going to get thrown out. I don't think they'll germinate. The plants that like shade go into this little contraption. It's sort of a shade house, but it's only a couple feet tall. The thing's on a hinge, so I can just flip it over and they have shade all summer long. But you can see I've sunk the pots in the soil. And I like this method because it keeps the seedlings much wetter. I don't have to water them every day. If I take these pots and put them out on a potting bench, I pretty much water daily. And in here, I sink them in the ground. Now, the other thing I do, which I forgot to mention, is the seedlings start inside the house, and I use Promex. So it's essentially peat moss with a little bit of perlite in there. So when I repot them, I always mix the soil, half of that soil, half peat moss, and half of my native soil. I have to find out whether these plants will grow with my pH. And I have a fairly high clay, so I'm in Guelph. And so I slowly wean off the seedlings from peat moss into my soil, because eventually they'll need to be in my soil. And so these pots are all sort of 50-50 mixes between those 2 soils. These ones are in the sunny area. And this is a picture of what they look like 2 or 3 years later. These are mostly shrubs. They're still in pots. They still get sunk in the ground. I do dig them up once a year to trim off any roots that are coming out the bottom of the pot and to look them over and make sure they're growing all right, maybe to repot them into a bigger pot. A lot of these shrubs will go out into the more wild areas of my property, And if I take plants that are only 6 inches tall and plant them out where there's 4-foot goldenrod, they're not going to survive. So I wait until the shrubs, they're going to be 3 feet tall before I'll put them out into the wild. So I just grow them up in here. Perennials, I move them depending on where they're going. So rock garden plants may only be 3-4 inches tall by the time I move them into their garden. Other perennials might be a foot tall before I move them out. But I like to have them a bit more mature so they can spend 2 or 3 years in pots before I move them somewhere. That's the end of my talk. I do have some announcements though. Guelph is putting on some more seminars, and we have a couple coming up. These are all free. So the first one there is a garden design seminar that I give. It's going to be 3 nights this year. These are all virtual talks. And then we have some really great speakers coming. So we have Nikki Japour, who's going to come talk about growing vegetables under cover. So that's mostly growing them in the cold seasons, you know, really, really early spring, really late fall kind of thing. We have Doug Ptolemy, which your group probably knows about. He's coming to talk about our insects. Dr. Alan Armitage will be talking about his favorite plants. Larry Hodgin is the laid-back gardener from Quebec City, and he'll be talking about ornamental grasses. And then we have Joseph coming to talk about plant shopping like a pro. And that's actually the most popular one out of all this. I wasn't sure if we should take that subject, but everyone seems to be interested. If you want to register, go to the Guelph Wellington Master Gardeners website. There's links there. It's all done through Eventbrite, so you can also search Eventbrite for these events. But the Master Gardener website will give you links to everything. It's the easy way to do it. I've written a couple books. One is Soil Science for Gardeners, and this launched about 10 months ago, and it's sold out. So, well, almost sold out. They've ordered their second printing, and to celebrate, my publisher has offered a 25% discount. So my publisher is New Society. You have to order this from them if you want the discount, and the discount code is Pavlis25. So that's my name with a 25 because it's a 25% discount. And you'll get that off whatever the price is. The ebooks are on sale now, and you get 25% on top of that. I've also written a book called Building Natural Ponds. About 12 years ago, I decided to put in a pond, and I wanted to put in a liner, but I didn't want to pump. I didn't want to fool around with all the chemicals and filters and all that stuff. I just wanted a natural pond, and everybody told me it wouldn't work, but not one person could explain why. So I went ahead and built it. It worked beautifully. I started writing some articles, and I was asked to write the book. So you can have a pond that takes no work, no electricity. The only thing I really do with this pond is to top up the water every year because we just don't get enough rain. I don't even scoop the leaves out of the bottom, although I probably should do that. And it's full of things. I have 2 different species of bulrushes that seed it themselves. I have lots of insects and all kinds of stuff floating around in there. And all the animals come and have a drink too. I've also written 2 other books. This is sort of my passion or garden myths. So each book has about 120 myths in it. Both books are completely different. This book is through a different publisher, so it's only available on Amazon and doesn't qualify for the discount. And that's the end of my talk.
Thanks a lot, Robert. We do have some questions in the chat, and if anybody has any more, you can add them. We're going to keep asking them. So one of the questions was, and we had a number of questions about the germination, and maybe you should spend a little time now talking about your Baggy method of germination.
Sure. So if you want to see the whole thing, there's a video called, well, it's labeled Baggies, I think, or Germination by Baggies, or the Baggy method. That's what it's called. So simply, it's you take a piece of tissue paper. I use one that's a little stronger than most, and I put it in the bag with some water and the seeds. I only use 1 layer of paper towel. It's actually not tissue paper, it's more of a paper towel. So I can see the seeds. And then I leave them in there. In fact, let me show you. Let's see how this works. Oh, this may not work too well because I have a virtual background. It may not, it's not going to work. Anyways, I have them in the little baggie and I just let them sit around. So I was going to show you these that are sitting on my desk here. They're peony seeds. I have a whole bunch in the fridge. And the thing I like about them is really two things. One is I can move them in and out of cold very easily. So I can have 200 of these little baggies in a very small space in the fridge, and they get their cold treatment. Then I bring them out for their warm treatment. If they don't germinate, I put them back in the fridge for a cold treatment. And I don't have all these pots sitting around that I have to take care of. So that's one reason I like it. The second reason I like it is I can see what's going on. I was on a Facebook just about an hour ago and someone was asking about, I think, lavender. Oh, they're delphiniums. Why aren't my delphiniums germinating? I've tried them for 3 years now and they're not germinating. So here's the problem. You buy seed, you put it in the soil, you cover it up, and you wait, and nothing ever happens. You don't actually know whether germination is the problem because you can't see if the seed actually germinated and then died. It could be the soil you're using. It could be too much moisture and you're killing off the seedlings before you see something green above them. So in the baggies, I can see them germinating. So at least I know the seed was good and I got something to germinate. Now I put it in my soil. If it doesn't grow, I have to blame the soil or my culture or the temperature, something else. It's also great for slow germinators. So I just mentioned my peonies here. They're really weird seeds. I let them sit on my desk, and these have been here for a year now. Some of them have been pulled out, but what happens is they germinate and they'll make a root, but they will not make the green leaf until they get a cold treatment. So they sit on my desk. I wait until I get a good root. Then I'll wait till the root's a certain size, and then I'll put it in the fridge and give them a cold treatment. And usually within 3 weeks, it's starting to make the first leaves, and I pull them out and pot them up. But I can see exactly what's going on. In soil, I can't, and that's why I like this method.
Okay, so thanks for that. Someone has asked, how cold is the cold treatment? I think you've answered that. Just a normal refrigerator temperature?
Just a refrigerator. So the other advice I see a lot is like for stratification, people will put them in the freezer. That's a really bad idea because you'll kill your seed, some seed. If seed's not fully dry, it will get killed in a freezer. And stratification is almost always a cold, wet treatment. So a lot of people read up on their seeds and it says, oh, stratify these. So they take the dry seed, they put them in the fridge, leave them there for a month, pull them out and say, I've stratified my seed. That doesn't work. The first thing that has to happen with seed is the moisture. It has to absorb water, and that water starts that germination process. Once that starts, then it needs the cold treatment. So anytime you use stratification, you do it in the fridge, but it has to be with moist seed.
Okay. And someone's asking, once germinated, can you put them into 4-inch pots? It looks like you put them all into 4-inch pots all together.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of depends. Like peony seeds are quite big, and I know the plants are big, and I don't have a lot of seeds. So those go into individual pots once they germinate. Like once I see a leaf, I put them into a 4-inch pot, or quite honestly, I use whatever pot I happen to have. Smaller seed, I might put the whole baggie into one pot, right? It sort of depends. Sometimes I split them into 2 or 3 pots if I have a lot of seed and it's something I might want for my wooded area, so I actually want lots of plants, then I'll put them into several pots. The pot size isn't too important as long as once they get crowded, they go into a bigger pot. Seedlings will always grow better if they have no competition and they don't get root bound.
And someone is...
Oh, sorry. Here's another myth for you. There's a very common myth that says when you have some seedling growing in a pot and you want to move it into a larger pot, you have to do this in stages. So you go from a little one to one that's slightly bigger to another one that's slightly bigger. That's a complete mess. The best thing for the plant is to go from a tiny pot to a really big pot. Okay. The reason we don't do that, and particularly why nurseries don't do that, is it takes up too much space and it takes up a lot of water and fertilizer. So their costs skyrocket if they do that. So they go up in stages. But as far as the plant goes, it wants to go from a little pot to a big pot. It doesn't need the in-between sizes.
Someone who's commented, she has gotten Trillium from seed to flower, but it took her 4 years. So,
yeah.
And that would be your experience sometimes too, I guess.
They can be very slow, yes. And that's why we're now, when we collect the Trillium seeds, we try to pick them really early when they're still green. And you can easily save 2 to 3 years if you do that. Get them green, keep them moist, and plant them right away. And at least some of those Trilliums will be up much quicker.
So how green are you picking them? Like when the pod is still quite white?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the seeds inside are still white too?
The seeds are pretty much white. They're starting to color a little bit, so they're a light tan color, but they don't have to be a dark brown.
So we have a question. Someone is starting to sow seeds for the first time. And a lot of the seeds say to avoid direct sunlight, but then other sources tell her to put them under grow lights. So she wants to know, what should she do? Avoid sunlight or put them under grow lights?
Okay,
What's the light level for seeds?
Yeah, so if it's still a seed, so it hasn't germinated yet, if it needs light, it needs very low levels of light, but high light won't harm it. You can put it out in full sun. That's good too. It just doesn't need that. In fact, if it needs light, the room light you have is fine. You don't even have to put them under fluorescent lights or seedling lights or anything like that. Just room light is enough to germinate it if the seed needs light. Once they germinate, you do have to give them as much light as you can. Now, you have to be a little careful in that I wouldn't take a little seedling and put it out in full sun. You're going to burn it, right? But if I take a seed and it's just starting to germinate, just making a root, and I put it in soil and I cover it with soil, I could take that and put it in full sun. It'll be fine, because the leaf hasn't come up yet. And in fact, the more light you give them at that point, the shorter the plants will be. So a good example is winter sowing. If you've never tried that, it's a fun thing to do. And essentially what you do is around Christmas time, you set up these pots, you put the seed in, and you put them outside in the snow and forget about them. And they get full sun as soon as they germinate, but they're used to it. They've only ever had full sun, so it doesn't harm them. And what you find with those seedlings is they'll be a few millimeters high, and the ones inside will be 3 inches high because of the difference in light. So winter sowing and that full sun gives you really strong seedlings. Now they're really short, so you can't get too upset because you've got tiny little plants. You've got tiny little really strong plants.
And someone's wanted to know there were 2 free webinars you talked about, and I think she missed the details on the first one.
Okay, so the
Garden Fundamentals, I think.
Yeah, the Garden Fundamentals is not free, but it's not particularly expensive. It's done through the university. So if you go to University of Guelph Arboretum workshops, you'll find them there. And the second one, go to the Guelph Wellington Master Gardeners website. And if you just Google Guelph Master Gardeners, you'll come up #1 on the list.
Okay. And someone's asking about, why is freezing a bad idea for moist seed? Isn't that what seeds experience in nature? Maybe you can explain the difference between freezing in a freezer and freezing in the ground.
That's a very good question, and I'd like to get a good answer to it. It's complicated. We do know that if a seed has too much moisture in it and we freeze it, it will get killed. So these seed banks that are planning to keep seed for a long period of time, they constantly measure the moisture level and they get it down to, I believe it's below 30%, but there's this magic number. And they want the moisture level below that before they will freeze the seed. Otherwise, it shortens their lifespan. Okay. Now, what's not clear is that if that seed has started going through this germination process, so it's absorbed some water and it's starting internally to start the process, hasn't made a root yet, but the chemical reactions are taking place, that seed may be able to take some freezing. I've tried an interesting experiment this year. I talked about winter sowing, and I always tell people, well, if you're doing winter sowing, don't put tropical seeds in there. Tropical seeds can't take the freezing, right? It doesn't make sense. And tomatoes are tropical fruits. So someone asked the question, well, then how come they send out all the tomato seeds in the wintertime and they all grow, right? If you order seeds now and they're tomatoes, the cold outside doesn't bother them. Well, part of it is that they are dried, so that may account for some. But I thought I'd do a little experiment this year. So I took some tomato seeds, I moistened them, I let them sit for 24 hours in water. They absorbed lots of moisture. And then I put them outside when we had a really cold spell. We had like 2 weeks of really cold weather in February. And then I brought them inside to see if they would germinate. And I have a lower germination rate from those seeds, but I still have 60% germination on those. So the freezing didn't kill those seeds. So freezing may not kill the seeds as much as we think it will, but we do know that moist seed does get damaged with freezing. So don't do it if you can help it. But there's more to the story, and I'm not sure what the real answer is.
So this question for me, so I see a lot now that people are recommending to avoid the 30, 90, 60, 120 day stratifications, to put seeds into the freezer for a few days, moist, pull them out for a few days, put them back in for a few days. And they're claiming they're able to speed up the stratification. Have you tried that, or would that end up killing the seed too?
I haven't tried it, and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. The question I would always ask people is, do you have a scientific study that shows that this actually works? Like, has it been tested by someone? And that technique is not one I've ever seen in any kind of literature. Now, many of our seeds that we try to grow have not been studied, so you're not going to find any scientific data on it. But a lot of seeds have. A lot of the native seeds, seeds that are a little rare and so on, like Trilliums, for instance, have been studied fairly extensively. And one of the things they're usually looking for is, what is the best way to germinate these seeds? And I would tend to go with that advice, not with some advice you get on the internet. But if you have some specific seed that I can get a hold of and try it, I wouldn't mind trying that experiment and see what happens.
And we have someone, any advice for bulbils, the bulb builds on lilies? And she's also asking, will Trillium self-seed? So two questions in one.
Will Trillium self-seed? Well,
garden.
any plant that makes seed will self-seed. Trilliums take quite a few years before you'll ever see a flower. So it's like a 5-year process. They're very slow to bulk up and form seeds. But if you find some native plants, you'll usually find the seedlings around the base. And the first few years, they'll probably just look like blades of grass. So unless you know what you're looking for, you wouldn't even notice them. The bulbils themselves, all I've ever done is just planted them in the ground and they will grow. But plant them shallow. Don't plant them as deep as you would a mother bulb. So in nature, they will fall off the plant and they'll basically be sitting on the top of the soil. And you can bury it in a little bit, but don't bury it too deep. They will over years, they will slowly move down to the depth that they want.
Do trilliums propagate themselves another way or just by seeds? And I think they do vegetatively propagate quite well.
On their own, I guess they would, but it's a slow process. So you can take a trillium that once the flower and leaf have sort of died back, you apparently can dig it up and you take the tuber. It generally only grows leaves and flowers at the tip of it. But if you cut it off so you have a front end and a back end, a lot of times the back end will resprout and create a new front end. So it's very similar to dividing an iris. They're kind of little tubers that are kind of long, and you kind of cut it into half or even thirds and then plant up each piece, and the back pieces will start growing. I guess it probably does that a bit on its own too, but it doesn't grow very fast. So it's only adding, I don't know, half an inch or quarter inch every year to the tip of that thing. It's not growing very fast.
I had a couple of questions on winter sowing, but I think you've just covered that. And someone's asking, why do you think peat moss is better than vermiculite?
When I use vermiculite, it's either too wet or too dry, and I just can't seem to get the moisture level right. And when I do things in vermiculite, they never germinate well. Things do much better in peat moss for me than in vermiculite. So I think it's a moisture thing, because we actually use the same vermiculite that my friend does. She gave me a bag and said, look, this is the really good stuff, use this. And I tried it and they just don't do well. And I suspect it's moisture level. The other difference is that my friend is very particular, and she looks at these seeds like every day. So I think she goes in there and she'll look at it and just add 2 drops of water and, just keep the right moisture. I don't have the patience for that. So I throw a bunch of water in there and let it sit on my desk for 3 weeks, and then it's probably too dry. And then I throw in a whole bunch more water. So I'm much more careless about that process. That's one of the reasons I like the Baggy method. It's kind of idiot proof. Now I do have to go in once in a while and add water if things are sitting there for a long period of time. So if these baggies that are sitting on my desk, I probably put water in here every 2 weeks or so, because they do dry out. In the fridge, it's a little longer. They dry less there. And I do have a video on the Baggy method too on my YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and look for Garden Fundamentals Baggy method, I'm sure it'll come up #1.
Okay. And
but I've been using it for, I don't know, 15 years, and I use it for almost everything. The 2 things I tend not to use it for are really, really tiny seeds, because they're a bit hard to get off, and I'm now just putting those on soil, and really large seeds. So, if I have like a chestnut type of thing, it doesn't really work well with the Baggy method. They're better off in peat moss.
So when now I tend to always put either seed starting soil or peat moss in a baggie, and that's my baggie method, because I found paper towels all went moldy. Have you got a solution for that, or have you used the peat moss in the baggie?
I do use peat moss for large seeds. So if they're more than your baby fingernail kind of thing, then I'll use peat moss, because that coats the seed a little better. But if they're smaller seeds, I'll do it in the baggies. And I don't really have a mold problem. I do sometimes, and I'm sort of convinced that when the seed is not fertile, it will mold up quickly. seed that's dirty, so there's a lot of chaff in there, that chaff will mold up. So I'll have a bag with maybe 5 or 6 seeds in there, and I'll have 3 of them very clean, no mold on them at all, and then a couple mold up fairly quickly. I'm pretty convinced those are not viable seeds. Viable seeds I've had in baggies for years in the same baggie, and you do get a bit of mold. You get some like red mold, little black spots in it, but not serious mold. As I said, I had the one that they were in the same bag for 5 years before they germinated. They're now 6 years old, and the mold in there is still not very present. Like there's very little on the paper. But some people use the method and complain about a lot of mold, and I'm not entirely sure why.
So it's pretty traditional in our, back in the before times when we actually had physical face-to-face seed workshops. We used the Baggy method quite a bit just because it's space saver, but generally we were putting them in either vermiculite or a little bit of seed starting soil.
Yeah.
That seemed to work.
Yeah.
And we have someone who's got tiny native strawberry seeds, and the package says to sow them in damp soil and keep them in the fridge for 3 to 4 weeks. She wonders, is there any faster way to do that? So is there a shortcut to that 3 to 4 weeks?
Well, again, I put them in the baggies because you see them germinate right away, right? If they would germinate after a week, you'd see it. If the package recommends 3 weeks cold stratification, I would give it the 3 weeks. Now, where did that time come from? Well, a lot of the information we have about seed starting is kind of arbitrary. So a lot of the rare seeds, and I don't include strawberries in there, I'm sure people have studied those and know how to germinate them, but a lot of the rare seed was done by someone called Dr. Dino. And he got seeds sent in from all over the place. He literally did thousands of seeds, and he ran through these seed germination procedures. And he would get some seed in, he tried some warm, he tried some cold, and some warm, cold, and so on. And he arbitrarily picked 3 months for that cycle. And he got success. Well, now everybody repeats the 3 months. That doesn't mean it needs 3 months. It might only take a week. The Erythema is a good example, right? If you had asked me a year ago, how do you do Erythema, I'd say, well, do them warm and it'll take 4 weeks to germinate, because every Erythema I've ever done took 4 weeks to germinate. Well, this year they took a week, right? So there's a lot we don't yet know about the seeds, but if there is a recommendation for 3 weeks cold, I would do 3 weeks cold, and I wouldn't try to rush that.
Okay, thanks.
Now there's nothing wrong with splitting them. So put them in 2 baggies, leave one for 3 weeks, take one out after a week, and see if they germinate.
So someone's asking about the seed exchange. The deadline for that was last Saturday, but we didn't have a lot of take up on it. And so I'm prepared to extend that because I have to sort out all these seeds. If some of you do want to order up some seeds, we had about 60 species, and a lot of them are left over. They're all native plants collected by mostly Wildflower Society members, although this year we did purchase some from Botany CA because she had a really nice collection of some of the rarer native plants.
Mm-hmm.
So if anyone still wants to get some seeds, go to the Nature Guelph Facebook page, and on there you should find the event listing for the seed workshop. There's a PDF there with all the seeds listed, and then you have to go to a different place and order the seeds. If you can't find that, then email wildflower@natureguelph.ca, and I will send you both the PDF and the instructions on that. If you're going to order some of those seeds in the next day or two, I might not have them ready for you to pick up until a week from now. So everybody else is getting their seeds this weekend. If you order kind of late and I don't have enough time, then you won't get those seeds to play with until a week from this weekend, but that's still enough time to cold stratify a lot of those. So I'm seeing no more questions in the chat. Does anybody have a final question that they want to send to Robert, or we're all educated now? So thanks a lot, Robert. It was good. We do seed workshop usually live every year, but we couldn't do that this year. So it was nice to have a seed expert come in, and you seem to have a wealth of knowledge and a lot of experience. And I did look at your YouTube videos, and I will say to everybody, go to Garden Fundamentals YouTube channel, and you will find a video on whatever question you're trying to answer. I don't know where you find the time to do them and everything else, but there's a lot of them there.
Yeah, well, right now I'm working on the vegetable one. So if anyone wants to grow vegetables, there's a 12-week series that's almost complete. So.
Okay, so thanks again, Robert, and
Okay,
everybody
nice to be
else.
here.
What's that?
Nice to be here.
Okay, thank you. Hope to see you at some of our events out too. And for the rest of you, don't forget about the upcoming seminars, particularly Lorraine Johnson on the 30th. I think Lisa is still on the call, so thanks out to Lisa, who is footing the bill for bringing in, so everybody give Lisa a little applaud. Lisa McTaggart for bringing in Lorraine Johnson to in 2 weeks' time. Okay, bye-bye all, and thanks a lot. We'll see you again.